They dared attack humans. Then the railgun answered. The stars looked peaceful from the observation deck of New Terran Station. But Captain Jake Morrison knew better than to trust the silence of space. He stood with his hands clasped behind, his back watching the mining ships come and go like fireflies against the black void. The colony below was thriving, its 12,000 inhabitants carving out a new life on this frontier world. Jake had been protecting this sector for 3 years now, and nothing more exciting than the occasional pirate skirmish had crossed his path. That changed when Lieutenant Kelly Brooks burst onto the bridge of the Liberty's Edge with a data pad clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, and Jake knew immediately that something was very wrong. She handed him the pad without a word, and he read the sensor data twice before he believed it. 15 unknown vessels had just appeared at the edge of the system, their energy signatures unlike anything in the Earth Defense Force database. Dr. Paul Hendricks joined them within minutes, his curiosity overriding his usual afternoon research schedule. The three of them stood in silence, watching the sensor screens as the unknown ships moved closer. They were massive, easily twice the size of Liberty's Edge, and their hulls seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm that made Jake's skin crawl. When Commander Lisa Grant contacted them from New Terran Station, her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the tension underneath. The first communication from the aliens came through in a burst of static, and then resolved into something that sounded almost like music. The translation software struggled for several minutes before it found patterns it could work with. The voice that emerged was cold and mechanical, stripped of emotion by the technology that bridged the gap between species. They called themselves the Vrotix Collective, and they claimed this entire sector of space as their ancestral territory. Jake initiated first contact protocols, keeping his voice calm and diplomatic. He explained that humanity had been mining this system for 5 years without encountering any other intelligent species. He offered to share the resources, to negotiate boundaries, to find a solution that would benefit both civilizations. The Vrotix response was immediate and absolute. They demanded that all human presence be removed within 3 planetary rotations. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no shared space between their species and humanity. Kelly ran every scan she could think of, trying to understand what they were facing. The Vrotix ships were biological in nature, grown rather than built, with weapons that seemed to be living organs attached to their hulls. Paul was fascinated despite the danger, pointing out how the ships appeared to heal minor damage almost instantly. Jake listened to their observations while composing his report to Earth Command. He recommended caution but not retreat. New Terran was a sovereign human colony, and they had every right to be here. The Vrotix gave them 2 days to respond. Jake spent those 48 hours trying every diplomatic channel he could think of. He offered technology exchanges, cultural ambassadors, joint scientific ventures, anything that might open a dialogue. The Vrotix ignored every overture. When Lisa contacted him from the station with her own ideas, he listened carefully. She had been a negotiator before becoming a station commander, and her instincts were usually good, but even she admitted that the aliens seemed to view any offer of compromise as a sign of weakness rather than strength. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jake was reviewing evacuation plans with Kelly when the sensors screamed. The Vrotix ships had moved into attack formation without warning, their weapons charging with a sickly green glow. Jake had exactly 18 seconds to sound the alert before the first salvo struck New Terran Station. The biological weapons tore through the station's shields like they weren't even there, ripping apart the hull and venting atmosphere into space. Jake Morrison had fought in the Mars Rebellion and survived 3 different boarding actions, but he had never felt as helpless as he did watching New Terran Station die. Lisa's final transmission was cut short when the command center took a direct hit. 3,000 people lived on that station, including families and children who had never known war. The Liberty's Edge moved to intercept its conventional weapons, firing as fast as the crew could load them, but the shots barely scratched the Vrotix bioships. Kelly coordinated the defensive fire while simultaneously calculating trajectories for the colony ships still docked at the station. Jake made the hardest decision of his career and ordered a full retreat. They couldn't save the station, but they could save the people still alive on those ships. The Liberty's Edge positioned itself between the fleeing colony vessels and the Vrotix fleet, taking hit after hit while the civilians escaped. Paul worked frantically in the medical bay, preparing for casualties that he knew would overwhelm his facilities. The ship shuddered with each impact, and twice the artificial gravity failed before emergency systems kicked in. Jake stayed on the bridge, his voice calm over the communications channel even as his ship fell apart around him. He called out coordinates to Kelly, who executed every maneuver with precision despite the failing systems. The Vratics seemed surprised when Liberty's Edge didn't break formation. They concentrated their fire trying to eliminate this stubborn little ship that dared to challenge them. Jake watched his hull integrity drop below 30% and knew they couldn't last much longer. But the colony ships were almost to the jump point, almost safe. He just needed to buy them another 2 minutes. Those 2 minutes felt like hours. The bridge filled with smoke as fires broke out in the lower decks. Kelly's tactical station exploded, throwing her across the bridge. Jake pulled her back to her feet, and together they kept the ship fighting. When the colony ships finally jumped to safety, carrying 6,000 survivors, Jake allowed himself one breath of relief before ordering his own retreat. The Liberty's Edge limped away from New Terran system with the Vratics in pursuit. Jake sent his report to Earth Command along with every scrap of data they had collected about the enemy. He included Lisa's final analysis and Paul's observations about the bioship's regenerative capabilities. Most importantly, he included his own conclusion written in plain language that no one could misunderstand. The Vratics were not interested in peace. They were not interested in coexistence. And they would not stop until humanity was driven from this sector of space or destroyed entirely. As his damaged ship crawled toward the inner colonies, Jake Morrison stared at the stars and wondered how many other human settlements were about to receive the same ultimatum. The peaceful exploration of space had just ended, and humanity wasn't ready for what came next. They dared attack humans. Then the Railgun answered. The news from New Terran spread across human space like wildfire, and panic followed close behind. Admiral Richard Cole stood in the war room deep beneath Geneva, watching the holographic display update with each new report. 7 more frontier colonies had detected Vratic ships on their sensors, and 3 had already begun evacuation procedures. The Admiral was a practical man who had spent 40 years in the Defense Force, but even he felt the weight of this moment pressing down on his shoulders. Dr. Sophie Lane arrived at the Lunar Development Complex with a proposal that seemed impossible. She had been working on electromagnetic acceleration technology for 15 years, refining theories that most scientists dismissed as too dangerous or impractical. Her research team had built small-scale prototypes that could accelerate a 1-kilogram projectile to incredible speeds, but the energy requirements were enormous. Now she stood before a room full of military officers and politicians, explaining how her railgun could save humanity. Lieutenant Commander Greg Palmer was already in space when the orders came through. His fighter squadron had been running patrol exercises near the Hope's End colony when the Vratics appeared. Unlike the methodical attack on New Terran, these aliens seemed to be testing human defenses, probing for weaknesses. Greg led his pilots in a furious engagement that lasted 17 minutes before the Vratics withdrew. He lost 2 pilots and damaged 4 more fighters, but they had held the line. Governor Marcus Webb refused to evacuate Hope's End, despite direct orders from Earth Command. His colony was home to 18,000 people who had invested everything they had into building a new world. Webb was a stubborn man who believed that running from a threat only invited more aggression. He organized the civilian population into militia units and armed them with whatever weapons the colony could produce. When Admiral Cole contacted him personally to demand evacuation, Webb's response was broadcast across the entire colony network for everyone to hear. Jake Morrison brought Liberty's Edge into Mars orbit on auxiliary power, the ship barely holding together after its fighting retreat from New Terran. Kelly Brooks had suffered a broken arm and severe burns, but she refused medical leave until she had downloaded every byte of tactical data to Earth Command. Paul Hendricks worked around the clock in the medical facilities, treating wounded crew members and analyzing tissue samples from Vratics weapons. What he found terrified him more than the battle had. The Vratics' biological weapons didn't just destroy, they infected. Crew members exposed to the green energy blasts were developing strange cellular mutations that Paul's medical database couldn't identify. He sent his findings to research facilities across human space, hoping someone could develop a treatment before the infections became fatal. 3 crew members died despite his best efforts, their bodies literally falling apart at the cellular level. Admiral Cole convened an emergency session of the Defense Council with representatives from every major colony attending via hologram. The debate was fierce and sometimes angry, with voices shouting over each other about evacuation plans and defensive strategies. Sophie Lane waited patiently for her turn to speak, knowing that panic had to burn itself out before logic could take over. When the room finally fell silent, she activated her presentation. The electromagnetic mass accelerator was deceptively simple in concept. Use powerful magnets to accelerate a solid projectile along a long rail until it reached a significant fraction of light speed. The kinetic energy released on impact would be devastating, far beyond anything conventional explosives could achieve. Sophie's calculations showed that a single railgun firing a 50-ton projectile could release energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. But without the radiation or political complications, the problem was power. A single shot required the entire output of a capital ship's reactor, leaving the vessel vulnerable for the 8 minutes it took to recharge. The weapon itself would run the length of a battleship's spine, making it impossible to hide or protect. Any ship carrying a railgun would be a massive target that could only fire once before needing to retreat and recharge. Some council members called it suicide, others called it desperation, but no one had a better solution. While Earth debated, the Vratics continued their advance. Hope's End was the next target, and Governor Webb's defiant stand became the rallying cry that humanity needed. His final transmission was brief and powerful. He stood in the colony's main square surrounded by armed civilians and told the watching galaxy that humans didn't surrender. The transmission cut off when Vratics bioships began their bombardment, and Hope's End died in flames. Greg Palmer watched the destruction from his carrier's observation deck and felt something cold settle into his chest. He had fought pirates and smugglers, dealt with accidents and emergencies, but this was different. The Vratics weren't interested in plunder or territory. They wanted extermination. He volunteered his squadron for the first railgun test mission, before Admiral Cole even announced they were looking for volunteers. Sophie Lane's team worked with an urgency that bordered on reckless. They had 3 battleships in various stages of construction at the Mars shipyards, and the decision was made to retrofit all of them with railgun systems. The lead ship, Titan's Hammer, would be ready first. Captain Nina Flores took command with full knowledge that her ship might become a floating weapons test that killed everyone aboard. She handpicked her crew from volunteers, refusing to order anyone into such obvious danger. Jake Morrison spent 2 weeks in debriefing sessions, going over every second of the new Terran battle until he could recite it in his sleep. Kelly worked with tactical analysts to develop countermeasures against the Vratics' regenerative hulls. Paul submitted his medical findings and then requested transfer to Titan's Hammer, arguing that someone with combat experience treating Vratics' weapons needed to be present for the first engagement. The Vratics broadcast a message across all human communication channels, transmitted from a command ship that sensors placed just outside the orbit of Saturn. The translation was clearer this time, the alien voice carrying unmistakable contempt. Humanity had 3 weeks to abandon 12 frontier sectors or face complete extermination. There would be no further warnings, no mercy, no consideration for surrender. The Vratics Collective had decided that humans were unworthy of sharing their space. Admiral Cole made his decision in the quiet hours before dawn. Sitting alone in his office with the weight of billions of lives on his conscience, he authorized deployment of the railgun despite the risks, despite the untested technology, despite knowing that failure would likely mean humanity's extinction. He drafted the orders personally, then walked down to the communications center to transmit them himself. Sophie Lane received the authorization with mixed feelings. She had spent her career developing weapons theory, never expecting to see her designs used in actual combat. Now humanity's survival depended on whether her calculations were correct. She double-checked every equation, ran the simulations one more time, and then authorized final construction. The railgun would either save humanity or prove that some problems couldn't be solved with physics and determination. 3 weeks wasn't much time, but human engineers worked miracles when properly motivated. The shipyards of Mars ran 24-hour shifts with crews sleeping in their workstations and eating on the move. Titan's hammer took shape around its massive spine weapon, the 3-kilometer acceleration rail gleaming under the construction lights. 2 sister ships followed close behind, their weapons only days away from completion. Intelligence reports showed Vratic's fleet movements converging on the Redemption colony, home to 40 million humans who couldn't possibly evacuate in time. Admiral Cole ordered the 3 railgun ships to deploy despite incomplete testing and skeleton crews. Captain Nina Flores brought Titan's hammer online with half its systems still in assembly mode and jumped toward Redemption, knowing she was leading humanity's last desperate gamble. Jake Morrison's repaired Liberty's Edge joined the battle group along with 24 other ships, all of them knowing the odds were impossible but going anyway because that's what humans did when backed into a corner. They dared attack humans. Then the railgun answered engineer Carl Murphy hadn't slept in 72 hours, and he wasn't planning to start now. The railgun installation on Titan's hammer was 98% complete, which meant there were still 1,000 things that could go catastrophically wrong. He crawled through access tunnels barely wide enough for his shoulders, checking magnetic coil alignments by hand because he didn't trust the automated systems. His team thought he was paranoid, but Carl knew that the difference between success and disaster often came down to a single loose connection. Captain Nina Flores walked the length of her ship, talking to every crew member she encountered. She knew most of them by name now. These volunteers who had signed up for what might be a one-way mission. The youngest was barely 20 years old, a gunnery technician named Lieutenant Ben Harper, who would be responsible for actually firing the weapon. Nina found him in the targeting bay, running simulations over and over, trying to shave milliseconds off his response time. The Vratic's fleet gathered at Redemption like vultures circling a dying animal. Overlord Zekthar commanded from his flagship, a massive bioship that pulsed with sickly green light. He had watched the humans flee from New Terran and Hope's End, and he was convinced of their weakness. These soft creatures with their primitive technology couldn't stand against the might of the Vratic's collective. The Overlord had already begun planning which human worlds he would claim after this easy victory. Admiral Cole's strategy was simple because complex plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. The 3 railgun ships would form a defensive triangle around Redemption, positioned at maximum range from the Vratic's fleet. Conventional warships would screen them, buying time while the weapons charged. Fighter squadrons would harass the enemy, disrupting their formations and drawing fire. It was a desperate plan that required everything to go right, and Cole knew from experience that nothing ever went right in combat. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of Liberty's Edge and felt a strange calm settle over him. He had been terrified during the retreat from New Terran, knowing he was responsible for every life aboard his ship. Now he felt only a cold determination. The Vratics had killed Lisa Grant and 3,000 others at New Terran. They had burned Hope's End and murdered Governor Marcus Webb. If today was going to be humanity's last stand, Jake was going to make sure the aliens remembered it. Kelly Brooks worked at her rebuilt tactical station, her injured arm still in a regeneration sleeve that itched constantly. She had studied the New Terran battle data until she could predict Vratic's movement patterns with 80% accuracy. That wasn't good enough, so she studied them more until the patterns were burned into her brain. When the fleet dropped out of jump space near Redemption, Kelly was already calculating firing solutions before the enemy appeared on sensors. The Vratic's fleet was enormous, over 200 bioships arranged in hunting formations that had worked for thousands of years, against dozens of other species. Overlord Zekthar watched the pitiful human force arrive and felt something like pity. 23 human warships against his armada was barely worth the ammunition. He transmitted orders to his subordinates to make the battle quick, to minimize damage to the planet below, because the Vratics would be claiming it soon. Nina Flores received confirmation from Carl Murphy that the railgun was ready to fire. The weapon had never been tested at full power, never been fired in combat conditions, and might very well explode and take the entire ship with it. Nina acknowledged the report and gave the order to begin charging sequence. The ship's reactor output climbed toward maximum, diverting power from shields and secondary weapons. Titan's hammer became a massive target that could barely defend itself, depending entirely on the other ships to keep it alive for 8 critical minutes. Greg Palmer launched his fighter squadron into a battle he knew most of them wouldn't survive. His pilots were young and scared, but they flew with precision, weaving through the Vortex formation and drawing fire away from the capital ships. The biological weapons of the alien fleet filled space with deadly green energy that dissolved fighters in seconds if it connected. Greg lost 3 pilots in the first minute, heard their final screams over the communication channel, and kept flying because stopping meant everyone died. The human warships fought with everything they had, conventional missiles and kinetic cannons firing non-stop at the advancing Vortex. The aliens' regenerative hulls absorbed the damage and healed almost instantly, proof that conventional weapons were nearly useless. But nearly useless was still better than nothing, and every second of delay was another second for the railgun to charge. Lieutenant Ben Harper watched his targeting display with absolute focus. He had trained for this moment in simulators and theoretical models, but the reality was overwhelming. 200 enemy ships moved across his screen in complex patterns that his computer barely tracked. Kelly Brooks was feeding him firing solutions from Liberty's Edge, her calculations refined by combat experience. Ben trusted her completely, his finger hovering over the firing control as the charge percentage climbed. Paul Hendricks worked in Titan's Hammer's medical bay with 4 other doctors, treating casualties as they came in from the screening ships. The battle was brutal and one-sided, with human vessels taking catastrophic damage while barely scratching the enemy. He had already pronounced 6 people dead when another explosion rocked the ship. The lights flickered as power was diverted to the railgun, and Paul worked by emergency lighting while the deck shook beneath his feet. Jake Morrison's Liberty's Edge took a direct hit that vaporized the port weapons array and killed 12 crew members. The ship's artificial gravity failed, and Jake found himself floating on the bridge, still giving orders while his crew scrambled to restore systems. Kelly worked at her station even though she was bleeding from a head wound, her fingers flying across the controls as she updated targeting data. On Redemption below, 40 million people watched the battle unfold on their screens and waited to see if they would live or die. Emergency shelters were full to capacity with families huddled together in the dark. Some prayed to gods they hadn't believed in for years. Others sat in silence, holding their children close. Everyone understood that if the defense failed, there would be no evacuation and no mercy. The railgun charge reached 70%, and Overlord Zekthar finally noticed something was wrong. The central human ship was barely defending itself, acting as a lightning rod that drew his fleet's attention. He ordered his subordinates to destroy it immediately, sensing a trap but uncertain what form it would take. Dozens of Vortex bioships converged on Titan's Hammer, their weapons charging for a killing blow. Greg Palmer saw the danger and made a choice that he knew would be his last. He pointed his fighter directly at the nearest Vortex command ship and pushed his engines past safety limits. The fighter's reactor warning screamed in his ears as he accelerated beyond what the hull could handle. His last transmission was simple. He told his squadron that it had been an honor to fly with them. Then Lieutenant Commander Greg Palmer crashed into the command ship at a significant fraction of light speed, and the resulting explosion took out 3 more bioships in a chain reaction that disrupted the entire Vortex formation. The sacrifice bought Titan's Hammer the seconds it needed. The railgun charge hit 100%, and every system on the ship screamed warnings about catastrophic power levels. Nina Flores ignored them all and gave Ben Harper permission to fire. The young lieutenant had already locked onto the densest cluster of Vortex bioships, following Kelly Brooks's targeting solution exactly. He pressed the firing control and prayed that Carl Murphy's engineering was as good as everyone said. The railgun fired with a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the vacuum of space, a deep thrumming vibration that every ship within 1,000 kilometers could feel through their hulls. The 50-ton tungsten carbide projectile accelerated down the 3-kilometer rail and left the ship at 0.85% of light speed. It crossed the distance to the Vortex fleet in less than a second, moving too fast for the aliens to detect or dodge. When the projectile hit, physics did what physics always does. The kinetic energy release was equivalent to 25 megatons, a small star born and dying in an instant. The targeted bioship and 16 others around it simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the impact. The shockwave from the explosion threw the entire Vortex formation into chaos, ships colliding with each other as they're careful. Formations fell apart. Overlord Zekthar's amusement turned to shock and then to something he had never felt before in thousands of years of conquest fear. These primitive humans had somehow created a weapon that his regenerative bioships couldn't heal from because there was nothing left to heal. He transmitted emergency evasion orders, but another human ship was already firing its railgun, and then a third. Each shot carved through his fleet like a knife through flesh, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. They dared attack humans. Then the railgun answered. The Vrotic's fleet that had seemed so unstoppable moments before was now breaking apart in confusion and panic. Overlord Zekthar screamed orders at his subordinates, demanding they reform and counterattack. But the carefully bred discipline of the collective was crumbling. His bioships had evolved over millennia to regenerate from any damage, but they couldn't regenerate from complete molecular destruction. The humans had found the one answer the Vrotics couldn't adapt to, and that realization spread through the fleet like poison. Captain Nina Flores felt Titan's hammer shudder as the railgun's heat dissipation systems struggled to handle the weapon's thermal output. Carl Murphy's voice crackled over the internal communication channel with damage reports and cooling estimates. The weapon needed 8 minutes before it could fire again, and Nina knew the Vrotics wouldn't give them that long. She ordered her helmsman to begin evasive maneuvers while the reactor built up charge for a second shot. Jake Morrison watched his tactical display transform from a scene of hopeless defense into something that looked almost like a fair fight. The Vrotics formation was scattered, ships colliding with each other as they tried to escape the kill zone around the railgun ships. Liberty's Edge was barely operational, but Jake pushed his damaged vessel forward anyway, its remaining weapons firing at targets of opportunity. Kelly Brooks called out coordinates with clinical precision, her voice steady despite the blood running down her face. Lieutenant Ben Harper's hands shook as he began selecting targets for the second shot. The first firing had been based on Kelly's calculations and Greg Palmer's sacrifice creating the perfect opportunity. Now he had to choose where to aim, which cluster of enemy ships represented the biggest threat. His training said to target command vessels, but the Vrotic's fleet structure wasn't showing clear hierarchies. He made his choice based on ship concentration and locked in the coordinates. The second railgun belonged to a ship called Valiant's Price, commanded by Captain Raymond Hayes. His vessel had taken less damage than Titan's hammer during the initial exchange, and his weapon charged faster as a result. Raymond was a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, but when he gave the order to fire, his tone carried the weight of 3,000 dead at New Terran and 18,000 more at Hope's End. The Valiant's Price railgun spoke with the same devastating authority, and another section of the Vrotic's fleet disappeared in a flash of kinetic fury. Overlord Zekthar's flagship took a glancing blow from the shockwave. Not a direct hit, but close enough to tear away half his bioship's sensory organs. The pain feedback through his neural link was excruciating. But worse was the tactical display showing his fleet being systematically destroyed. The humans had baited him perfectly, drawing his forces into a concentrated formation that maximized the railgun's effectiveness. He had underestimated them, assumed their lack of biological technology made them primitive, and now his arrogance was costing the collective everything. Paul Hendricks treated burns and impact injuries in Titan's Hammer's medical bay while the ship's frame groaned under the stress of sustained combat. A young ensign died on his operating table despite Paul's best efforts. Another life added to the cost of this desperate battle. He had stopped counting casualties after the first hour, focusing instead on saving whoever he could. The deck lurched as the ship executed an emergency turn, and Paul braced himself against the surgical station. The third railgun ship, named Humanity's Resolve, suffered a critical hit to its reactor, just as the weapon reached 90% charge. Captain Susan Lloyd made a choice in the 3 seconds she had left. She could shut down the weapon and save her ship, or she could risk everything for one more shot. Susan thought about the families sheltering on Redemption below and ordered the firing sequence to continue. The railgun fired successfully, but the reactor overload from the damaged systems caused a cascading failure that tore the ship apart from the inside. Jake Morrison heard Susan Lloyd's final transmission and felt something cold settle in his chest. She had just sacrificed her entire crew for that one shot, and the tactical display showed it had been worth it. 37 Vrotic's bioships vanished in the explosion, including what Kelly identified as a secondary command vessel, but the cost was 300 human lives. 300 volunteers who knew the risks and went anyway. The Vrotic's fleet was down to less than half strength, But that still meant over 100 bioships against 20 human vessels. Titan's Hammer and Valiant's Price were charging their railguns for another volley, but both ships were heavily damaged and barely maneuvering. The conventional warships formed a defensive screen, their weapons fire more effective now that the enemy's morale was broken and their regenerative systems were overwhelmed by sustained damage. Kelly Brooks detected a pattern in the Radix retreat vectors and realized they were trying to regroup at a rally point behind Redemption's moon. She transmitted the coordinates to Ben Harper and Captain Hayes simultaneously, knowing that if the aliens successfully reformed, they would overwhelm the exhausted human fleet. Her calculations showed a narrow window where both railguns could target the rally point before the Vratics completed their regroup. Overlord Zekthar reached the rally point with 73 ships, less than a third of his original fleet. The humans had broken the Vratics Collective's perfect record of conquest, shattered the myth of biological superiority, and proven that raw kinetic force could overcome regeneration through sheer destructive power. He ordered his remaining forces to prepare for a final assault, knowing that victory was now impossible, but hoping to inflict enough damage that humanity would think twice about pursuing them. Nina Flores received the targeting data from Kelly Brooks and had Carl Murphy run the calculations twice to verify they could actually make the shot. Firing around a planetary body at targets on the far side was theoretically possible, but incredibly difficult. The projectile would have to curve slightly in the moon's gravity well, a ballistic calculation that required perfect timing. Carl confirmed it was possible with a 72% chance of success, and Nina decided those odds were good enough. Titan's Hammer and Valiant's Price fired within seconds of each other, their railgun projectiles racing toward the rally point at nearly the speed of light. The gravitational curve worked exactly as calculated, bending the projectiles' trajectories just enough to bring them into the Vratix formation. The double impact created a devastating explosion that destroyed 46 bioships and damaged most of the rest beyond their ability to regenerate. Effectively, Overlord Zekthar's flagship survived by pure chance, positioned just outside the blast radius. He stared at his tactical display showing barely 24 functional ships remaining, and for the first time in his long life, he considered the possibility of defeat. The humans had done the impossible, turned a hopeless defense into a stunning victory through weapons that were crude, but devastatingly effective. He transmitted the order to retreat, something no Vratix overlord had done in living memory. Jake Morrison watched the Vratix fleet jump away and felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Liberty's Edge had lost 40% of its crew, and the ship itself would need months of repairs before it was combat-ready again. Around him, the rest of the human fleet was in similar condition. They had won, but the cost had been terrible. Greg Palmer was dead, Susan Lloyd and her entire crew were gone, and hundreds more had been wounded or killed in the fighting. On Redemption below, 40 million people emerged from their shelters to see the debris field orbiting their world. The celebration was muted, tempered by the understanding of how close they had come to extinction. Every family knew someone who had died in the defense, and the memorial services would last for weeks. But they were alive, and that was more than anyone had dared hope for when the Vratix fleet first appeared. Admiral Cole received the battle reports from Luna Command and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before the weight of command returned. They had won a single battle, but the war was far from over. The Vratix Collective was an ancient power with resources across dozens of star systems. One defeat wouldn't stop them. It would only make them more dangerous. But humanity had proven something important today. Proven that determination and ingenuity could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Captain Nina Flores walked the corridors of Titan's Hammer, checking on her crew and assessing the damage. The railgun had performed beyond expectations, but the ship itself was barely functional. Carl Murphy was already drawing up repair plans that would take months to complete. Lieutenant Ben Harper sat in the targeting bay, staring at his display screen and processing the fact that he had just killed thousands of sentient beings with a few button presses. Nina sat beside him and told him what Greg Palmer had proven with his sacrifice. Sometimes the only way to save lives was to be willing to take them. They dared attack humans. Then the railgun answered. 3 months after the Battle of Redemption, Earth's orbital shipyards worked around the clock producing railgun-equipped vessels. The victory had proven the weapon's effectiveness, and Admiral Richard Cole was determined to press that advantage before the Vratics could develop countermeasures. President Helen Cruz stood in the observation deck of the Luna Command Station, watching construction crews assemble the newest carrier, its spine bristling with 6 separate railgun accelerators. The ship was being named New Terran in honor of the colony where everything had started. Jake Morrison wore his new admiral's insignia uncomfortably, still adjusting to the weight of commanding a battle group instead of a single ship. His promotion had come through despite his protests that he was a ship captain, not a fleet commander. Admiral Cole had overruled him with the simple observation that Morrison understood the Vratics better than anyone else alive, having survived 2 separate engagements. Now Jake stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive dreadnought called Defiance Answer, planning offensive operations into Vratics territory. Dr. Sophie Lane's research complex on Luna had expanded to 3 times its original size. Her railgun design was being refined constantly, with newer models that charged faster and fired more frequently. The original 8-minute recharge time had been reduced to 30 seconds through improved reactor designs and better heat dissipation systems. Sophie worked with teams of engineers to solve problems she had never anticipated during the theoretical phase, but each solution brought the weapon closer to perfection. Lieutenant Kelly Brooks had been promoted to commander and assigned to Jake Morrison's staff as his chief tactical officer. Her analysis of the Redemption battle had become required reading at every military academy, and her targeting algorithms were now standard on all railgun vessels. She still had nightmares about watching New Terran Station die, but she channeled that trauma into making sure humanity never suffered another surprise attack. The Vratics had not been idle during those 3 months. Reports from deep space scouts indicated massive fleet movements, with bioships converging on staging areas throughout their territory. Overlord Zekthar had been stripped of his command after the Redemption disaster, replaced by commanders who understood that humanity posed an existential threat. But the collective's leadership was divided on how to respond, with some advocating retreat and others demanding total war. Ambassador Peter Quinn worked tirelessly to establish diplomatic relationships with other species, seeking allies or at least neutral parties who wouldn't join the Vratics against humanity. His breakthrough came with the Karathi Federation, a warrior culture that respected strength and was impressed by humanity's refusal to surrender. The Karathi agreed to maintain neutrality and share intelligence about Vratics movements, which proved invaluable for human strategic planning. Captain Nina Flores had recovered from her injuries and returned to command of Titan's Hammer, now fully repaired and upgraded with the latest railgun technology. Lieutenant Ben Harper remained her gunnery officer, his skill with the weapon system making him one of the most valuable people in the fleet. Carl Murphy had been awarded the Defense Force's highest civilian honor for his engineering work, though he insisted the medal was premature because he was already designing third-generation railgun systems. Jake Morrison's battle group began offensive operations in the 4th month after Redemption. Their strategy was surgical: jump into Vratics-controlled systems, target military installations with railgun strikes, and retreat before reinforcements could arrive. The operations were risky but effective, destroying shipyards and supply depots while avoiding civilian casualties. The Vratics learned to fear the appearance of human warships, knowing that their regenerative technology was useless against kinetic weapons. The turning point came when intelligence reported a massive Vratics fleet assembling near their core worlds. Overlord Zekthar, restored to command after proving himself in several defensive actions, was planning a final desperate assault on Earth itself. The fleet numbered 80 bioships smaller than the force at Redemption, but led by commanders who had studied human tactics and developed countermeasures. They planned to jump directly to Earth's Jupiter orbital yards, destroying humanity's shipbuilding capacity before the railgun fleet could respond. Admiral Cole received the intelligence from Ambassador Quinn's Karathi contacts and immediately understood the danger. If the Vratics destroyed the Jupiter yards, humanity's production advantage would disappear. He ordered Jake Morrison to intercept the enemy fleet with every available railgun-equipped vessel. The resulting battle group was smaller than what they faced, 20 ships against 80. But Cole was betting that quality would triumph over quantity. Jake Morrison gathered his captains in a secure holographic conference and laid out the situation plainly. The Vratics were coming for Earth, And if they succeeded, humanity would lose not just the shipyards but the morale advantage gained at redemption. The captains voted unanimously to engage despite the odds, knowing that retreat would doom billions of people. Nina Flores smiled grimly and quoted Governor Marcus Webb's final transmission. Humans didn't surrender. The two fleets met near Jupiter's orbit in a battle that would be studied by military historians for generations. The Vratics had learned to maintain dispersed formations that minimized railgun effectiveness, and they had developed tactics to target the human ships during their vulnerable charging cycles. Overlord Zekthar commanded from his rebuilt flagship, determined to redeem his earlier failure by crushing humanity's industrial heart. Kelly Brooks coordinated targeting data across the entire battle group, treating the 20 ships as a single integrated weapon system. Her algorithms predicted Vradix movements and pre-positioned railgun solutions, reducing the human response time to mere seconds. When the Vratix fleet arrived expecting to fight ships that took 8 minutes between shots, they instead faced coordinated volleys firing every 30 seconds. The battle was swift and brutal. Titan's hammer took the first shot, vaporizing 3 bioships that had clustered too closely. Before the Vradix could react, Valiant's Price fired from a different angle, then Defiant's answer, then 3 more ships in rapid succession. The dispersed formation that should have protected the Vradix instead spread them too thin to provide mutual support. Human ships hunted in coordinated pairs, one firing while the other recharged. Paul Hendricks coordinated medical response across the fleet from his position on Titan's hammer, directing injured ships to fall back while fresh vessels moved forward. The casualty rate was lower than at redemption thanks to better tactics and improved defensive systems, but people still died with every Vratix salvo. He treated burn victims and impact injuries with practiced efficiency, knowing that every person he saved was another human who would see tomorrow. Overlord Zekthar watched his fleet disintegrate with growing despair. The humans had evolved their tactics faster than the Vratix could adapt, turning the railgun from a clumsy weapon that fired once per battle into a rapid-fire system that dominated the battlefield. His bioship's regeneration meant nothing when each hit completely destroyed its target. He transmitted orders to retreat, hoping to save what remained of his fleet for a defensive fight. Jake Morrison saw the Vradix formation breaking and made a command decision that went against every tactical manual. He ordered his battle group to pursue, to drive the attack home and eliminate as much of the enemy fleet as possible. The risk was enormous because a desperate enemy could inflict terrible damage, but Jake understood that this was humanity's chance to end the war. If the Vradix escaped to regroup, the fighting would drag on for years. The pursuit lasted 17 minutes and covered millions of kilometers. Human railguns fired continuously, each shot requiring split-second timing as targets maneuvered desperately to escape. Nina Flores pushed Titan's hammer harder than she ever had, the ship's systems screaming warnings as the railgun cycled faster than recommended safe parameters. Carl Murphy monitored the weapon remotely and made real-time adjustments to keep it from destroying itself. When the battle ended, 73 Vradix bioships were debris, and the remaining 7 were too damaged to pose a threat. Overlord Zekthar's flagship was among the destroyed vessels, the commander going down with his ship in a final act of defiance. The Jupiter yards were untouched, and humanity's industrial capacity remained intact. Admiral Cole received the battle reports and immediately authorized doubling production targets. The Vradix Empress Charnel watched the defeat from her throne, whirled and understood that continuing the war meant the extinction of her species. The humans had proven themselves to be resourceful, determined, and capable of rapid technological advancement. More importantly, they were willing to fight to the last ship rather than surrender. She contacted President Helen Cruz through neutral channels and offered terms. The peace negotiations took 3 weeks, with Ambassador Quinn leading the human delegation. The Vradix agreed to withdraw from all contested territory, pay reparations for the colonies they had destroyed, and establish demilitarized zones between the two species. In exchange, humanity agreed to cease offensive operations and establish faux